All right. Last up, the former cold case detective, now full-time apologist, who wants to talk with Kurt Jaros. I believe that's how you pronounce his name, in an interview. And Kurt's going to ask him about what led him to think that the Gospels specifically, were eyewitness testimony.
So I read through the Gospels and I discovered that they're really encased in what they appear to be claims about true events that actually happened in the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I thought, okay, learned a long time ago, you don't trust any eyewitnesses, even on any case. They can tell you something really cool, something that will help your case. They can say, oh yeah, I saw him do that. Don't trust it. I've been a fool many times when people early on in my career would tell me something that was untrue.
Everyone who he's talking about, the people who have fooled him in the past and given him eyewitness testimony that they lied about, at least, it could be established that they were eyewitnesses of something, right? We placed them at the scene of the crime or near the scene of the crime or wherever it was that they saw whatever they saw. That's something you've done. We haven't even got into the Bibles. Let's say that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. You're acknowledging that still could be full of lies. That you, in your day-to-day work as a detective, have come across witnesses who deliberately lied about things. That's not even on the table. It's just something I realized just now that you're kind of admitting. You're not on a good start.
So I always test it. And then if I test it and it passes the test, well, then I will trust him. So if I could test the Gospels in these 4 categories, were they really written early enough to contain eyewitness testimony at all?
Okay, good question. Were they written early enough to contain any eyewitness testimony at all? Now, that's a weird phrasing, to contain any eyewitness testimony at all, because that's not the standard that I think you want to uphold, right? Or that I was a Christian was told that the Gospels were absolutely rooted in eyewitness testimony. In fact, a lot of Christians just hate over the fact that Mark and Luke, even if you accept everything that Christian scholars say about them, those Mark and Luke weren't firsthand witnesses, right? They got their stories from other people. Anyway, the question is, were they written early enough? No. J. Warner Wallace, for some reason, has some kind of extremely fringe dating that he accepts about when the Gospels were written. He thinks they were all written in the 40s, possibly even earlier, possibly late 30s. He has his own reasons for this. He rejects all scholarship, and we're going to get into that. Most scholars agree with the whole first Gospels written in the 70s, and if you look at John, possibly, up to 40 years after that. That's where consensus tends to lie. In that day and age, that's a generation away. That's not the eyewitnesses hanging on. Now, yeah, can they live to 90? Yeah, random people live to 90, sure. But generally, no.
Not written early enough, then they don't contain you have to be there in order to say you were there too,
Yeah, and you haven't established that in any credible way. So I don't know how you went from atheist to believer based on that question.
Can they be corroborated in some way? 3, have they
went through that quickly? 2, can they be corroborated in some way? Again, we don't have any. We're going to get to how well the accounts corroborate each other. Maybe that's what he's referring to. But certainly, there are very, very few details that we can corroborate externally. So, no.
Change their story over time, or have they been honest and accurate? 4.
Have they changed their story over time? That's tough to tell. The Gospels, again, because as far as we know, they wrote 1 book and then exited the scene, or at least, I guess, the author of Luke wrote 2 books. But it's tough to know what they held to over time. Again, this is a weird question that you say part of what led you to Christianity. Don't know how you possibly affirm that.
They possess some bias that would cause them to lie. This is how we test eyewitness.
They possess some bias that would cause them to lie. Now, it's again a weird question because bias doesn't always prompt us to lie. Bias can also just prompt us to see facts in a way that is most charitable to our point of view, but not necessarily the reality. I'm not saying the gospel writers, any of them, had to tell a single lie or to write down a single thing they didn't personally believe, but we'll get to all that. But again, did the gospel writers have biases? Absolutely they did. In fact, they had internal biases where they were correcting each other's stories because they didn't agree on the nature of what Jesus appeared to do and how his divine nature works, all that kind of thing. There's theological differences.
This is, if you look at the experts you have, how do we develop expertise in something? You've got people who are either experts in philosophy, or they have great manuscript expertise, or they have great expertise in the history of the first century, or the history, in this case, of ancient times regarding Jewish culture. And that gives you a certain...
That all sounds pretty good. Those are kind of experts. Yeah, you'd want to call to the witness stand, right? They're experts in first century Palestine. They are good at textual criticism. They're good at philosophy, good at history, all these kind of things. Those are a lot of good experts to call. What do you think, Jim? Should we call any of those?
An expertise. That's not who I am. It's not.
Now, to be fair, I'm not either. I am similarly merely standing on the shoulders of giants and interpreting what those who have better studied this have to say. So I can't fault you for that, Jim, but good admission.
But that's not who jurors are either. Jurors are not experts. They're just regular people. And they're people who are passionate. That's why you try to pick people that care.
They care for the law and justice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That are smart enough. They want to serve. They want to be there. And you don't expect them to be experts in the area in which you're investigating. As a matter of fact, I will not allow.
So I'm trying to extrapolate this. So what Jim is saying is that the people who have to decide whether Christianity is true are also not experts in history or all that kind of stuff. So this is going to get into anti-intellectualism, which I can't stand. The whole notion that we're all just common sense folk. And so when these fancy people with their degrees in textual criticism and in history, well, that's just fancy folk talk. We need it dumbed down. So Detective Wallace, can you dumb it down for us so that we can just accept what we already believe? That'd be awesome. Maybe tell us a folksy story about one of the criminal cases you worked on, because that's cool. We like true crime.
Allow experts on my jury. I may call experts, but you don't put experts on your jury because they sometimes are prideful. And so that's what I try to do in my.
You don't put experts on the jury because sometimes they're prideful. All humans can be prideful, right? But I discount what experts have to say or how an expert is going to evaluate this field because they are potentially prideful. Demonstrate first that they're prideful, detective, and then we will take that into consideration. Otherwise, it just sounds, man, you sure don't want to have to put your claims up to the scrutiny of experts.
Books. And when I just try to say, look, I get it. There's lots of views on this. There's lots of experts in manuscript evidence, lots of experts around the first century related to Israel or related to the context in which Jesus lived. But it turns out all these experts don't even agree with each other on most things. What I can help you do is see.
All right. So the people who have studied this all their lives and have the credentials and are experts, all the things that you listed in first century life, Palestine, all that kind of stuff, textual criticism, those people, when they look at all the details, why they don't agree. It's almost as if there's nuance and subtlety. And we can't have that. We're in a jury verdict situation here. We need to say guilty or not guilty. So in Jay's black and white world of living, we can't just sit aside and say, well, I don't know. It's true. Boy, the experts say it's nuanced, so I can't definitively say something. Nope. What Jay's going to come in and say, well, they all disagree. So let me come in and tell you what's the common sense way to look at it for we common folk who aren't cluttering our heads with all the nuance and detail.
How to put the evidence case together and how to arrive at the most reasonable inference that you could actually throw to a jury. And so for me, that's what I tried to do. And one of those tool sets that I realized early on is that people will say that these differences between accounts have to be resolved in some way.
All right. Do differences need to be resolved in some way? In a criminal case, if two different witnesses came and said some things that didn't seem on the surface to be compatible with each other, I think in a jury situation, you absolutely would need to come up with some level of harmonization to make it make sense why eyewitness testimony number 1 and eyewitness testimony number 2 seem to contradict each other. Now, a lot of times that's going to come down to, well, they were looking from different vantage points, or they just have a different perspective on life, or, they saw different things literally because of their physical vantage point. To convict someone beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal case, if there was big contradictions in those testimony and that wasn't at least put forth some kind of reason why they contradict, that would be a flag. That'd be a problem.
That we resolve the differences between the Gospels. And what I see a lot of people who have manuscript expertise, who are wrestling with this and are willing to concede certain issues, to concede certain points of Scripture even, because they're trying to resolve the differences between the Gospels.
All right. So it sounds like Detective Wallace's whole speech here is directed somewhat at Christian scholars who are attempting to harmonize passages. To an extent, I kind of agree. I feel like the people who offer harmonization options, some of them do compromise where you have to say, well, if your harmonization story is true, then the Bible is not inerrant in the way that I used to think it was or want to believe that it is. So that's a bit of a road too far. For example, Mike Licona puts a lot of the differences into the category of genre differences or storytelling goals and just literary license, as it were. And that, that accounts for a lot of them. I actually think he's done a good job in some of his books at presenting why that can account for a lot of these differences. The trouble is, what you have to say then is that the authors were not inerrant again in that same way. And for someone coming from the outside I understand why inerrancy is not a big deal. J. Warner Wallace is coming at is, are these reliable? But a lot of us were raised to say these were inerrant. Again, going back to that first story, if it's only 99% true, well, then there's a huge problem. And some of these harmonizations would definitely have to say the Bible's only 99% true. Again, for me, and we're going to get to this, the differences never bothered me. What bothers me is the sameness. So I have the exact opposite concern. Yes, but let's get to it.
And those people all have great expertise in history and in manuscript evidence, but they have never worked with eyewitnesses. They have never interviewed 3, 4, 5, 6 people who see the same event, and then they come to you within hours of seeing it.
Within hours of seeing it is a whole different standard than what we got with the Bible. Again, we're talking about even in it's years or decades. So we're not talking about recently. I just want to go to this idea that Jim's saying here that these scholars have never interviewed witnesses. And I will grant that probably these scholars have never dealt with witnesses on a level that you have, certainly as a detective. But we've all had times in our lives where, we're listening to 2 different versions of the story or 3 different versions of the story, and you're trying to at least suss out. So we can imagine it. It seems rather uncharitable to say that they wouldn't necessarily understand this perspective. I get that you have more expertise in this area, and that's the unique proposition that your ministry and your many book sales bring. So sure, lean into it.
The story, they never line up. They never match. Yet I don't start sacrificing the details in order to arrive at the truth, because this is what reliable eyewitness testimony looks like. And the only thing I ever say to anybody when a
Yeah, I actually just want to say I think that is probably correct. Probably most of the time, you take 2 eyewitness statements, they're not going to align on every single detail. For sure. And that makes sense.
dispatcher dispatches me to a homicide, I only have one request that I make.
One request.
And that is, you've got officers at the scene, right? I'm going to be an hour before I get there. I got to put a suit on. It's 2:00 in the morning. So I'm going to be a little while getting there. So do me a favor, have your officers separate the eyewitnesses. That's the only instruction I offer.
Okay. Now we are into territory I care about. So Jim has only one request, that we separate the witnesses, and that is so that they don't collude. You want to make sure that they don't have a chance to get their stories straight. You spent all this time saying that proper non-colluded eyewitness testimony has variations, so let's just avoid collusion and then we're good to go. Can anyone look ahead? Anyone let me know in the comments or in the chat why that's a problem for the Gospels?
As I know that if they don't separate those eyewitnesses, I'm going to get the same story 5 or 6 times. And I don't want the same story. I want it to be nuanced. I don't want them to talk to each other and try to resolve the alleged differences. Those differences, number one, are not really what you think they are. And they are built into a witness's geographic difference in the crime, also their personal histories, the things they're interested in. If I'm a gun nut, I'm probably going to get the gun details down. If I'm a clothing nut, I'm probably going to get the clothing details down. And I need to know enough. I'll be interviewing and asking those kinds of questions so I know who to trust on certain issues, who might see things more. Like, why would you just leave that detail out? I didn't even notice it. Well, how could you not notice that? That's not his interest. And so I need to figure out what are your interests so I can see why it is you wouldn't notice something. So a lot of these alleged discrepancies that I see a lot of theologians and academic people wrestle to try to figure out what is the overarching reason. And I'll just be honest, I'm not impressed with any of that, because I just know that the one thing I can help you with is what it looks like to interview eyewitnesses, because that's what I've been doing for a living
It's interesting. This is actually kind of similar to what Frank's last thing was. But he's acknowledging, there's all kinds of problems, and it takes people their whole careers to try and come up with the reasons why these things reconcile. But don't you worry your pretty head about that. It doesn't matter in the big picture. That's all just unnecessary bluster from the ivory tower. We down here on the day-to-day, in the trenches, we know that stuff doesn't really matter. Trust me.
30 years. And it does teach you that there's a certain level of variation you should expect to see. I can't give it to you in numbers, but it's something you just start to get comfortable with. And then I see it's outside that range, then I'm going to ask penetrating questions. But if I see it's under that range, I'm going to go, you guys have been talking to each other, haven't you?
Okay. So I agree. When it is too similar, there starts to be concerns. So let's talk about the synoptic problem. So those of you familiar with the Gospels may know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, synoptic Gospels, called so because they're very similar to each other, are so similar that it is beyond question at this point, really, that Luke and Matthew copied from Mark in many places, word for word. And what is actually slightly disturbing is when it's not word for word, the word changes then seem to be for theological reasons, not because they had a different perspective or they had a different story. It is so bad that the alleged author of Matthew, who would be Matthew, the tax collector, follower of Jesus, when he tells the story of when Matthew met Jesus, he borrows it entirely from Mark, doesn't bother adding any perspective or even first person to the story. If you met Jesus and then you went on to write an autobiography of Jesus, it seems unlikely that the story of you meeting Jesus, that you would copy that word for word from someone else's story. It seems like that would be, if any point, the point where you would interject, again, this different perspective that you were supposed to have. But no. So for me, the biggest problem with the Gospels is that they clearly copied from each other in exactly the way you say is a huge problem. So while everyone is feeling consternation and waving their hands about differences, no, I don't care about the differences. What about this similarity? Tell me about that.
That's where I'm at.
So what you mean by variation is that the stories will be different from one person.
It's going to be different. Oh my God,
next.
Oh, absolutely. And there'll be some that will be so different that give me an example of this. So order matters. And the reason why we try to separate the eyewitnesses is we don't even want them next to each other when we finally interview them. So we're going to separate the eyewitnesses and then we're going to keep.
Good. That'd be great. If the gospel writers didn't clearly copy off each other's work, then I could have some better confidence that these are somehow based in eyewitness testimony.
These people separated, and we're going to talk to each one individually. I don't want the other people to hear what this guy says. But there are times when you just can't help it for whatever reason. You're now dealing with somebody who, for whatever reason, is aware of what the others said. Maybe he comes to you several days later and he's talked to one of the other eyewitnesses, but he didn't want to stick around on the night of the murder. So now he's coming back in, but he knows what that one eyewitness is.
Yeah, that's a problem, right? And maybe Jim's going to tell us how police deal with this scenario and how the police, in a situation where you obviously know that there's collusion, how do we suss out some kind of kernel of truth from the second guy? That'd be great. Can you give us any hints?
Already said. Maybe somebody gets wind of it in the press and they release certain details you don't want released, and then you find a witness come forward. This is really true on cold cases, because after a while we start releasing details, and then you got to deal with the guy who comes in 10 years later and he's aware of what the original details are. So what happens is typically those kinds of witnesses will quickly just fill in the gaps. They already know you have the overarching story, and they will simply fill in gaps for you. Like they'll say,
I'm confused about this analogy when it comes to the gospel. So he's trying to say that when a witness comes in and he knows that his testimony is not unique, he just spews out some differences, but that's not what the gospels do. It's not like the author of Luke and the author of Matthew said, hey, you know what, go read Mark, and then here's some supplementary note. No, they retold all the things in the same word for word. So, and then just interjected a few things here and there. So what Jim is saying he saw on his case and his expertise is actually the opposite of what we see in the gospel, right? Am I wrong? Let me know in the comments.
I'm going to clarify something that I think people have been telling you, and then they will clarify. And you're like, well, look, okay, I get that, but just do me a favor, pretend like you don't know what they already told me. And please just start at the first and just walk me through what you saw. I don't want you to try to fill in gaps. We can do that later. But what I want right now is for you to start in the very beginning.
I'm still super unclear as to how this example is supposed to somehow be a parallel to what we have in the Gospels. What he's actually saying, well, I wish they would do X, but unfortunately, I mean, it is what we have with the Gospels, but they didn't put it in their own words. They just copied the other guy's words and interjected a few theologically significant things for them as they're different. So let me know what I'm missing. Maybe I'm missing Jim's point here. I'm willing to concede that I don't quite understand.
And so you'll see that if there's somebody who comes in late who's aware of the prior testimony, you're going to have to do this. And so when I see that John, for example, has a different kind of gospel that includes elements of the synoptics, but really includes clarifications.
That's a relatively new thing in scholarship. I'm glad Jim's going with it because it is kind of obvious. The author of John, with the books written decades later, either had heard what was in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. How could you pretend that these are the founding documents of the church, but the author of John writing decades later didn't know about them? And or he may have had copies of one or more of them literally in front of him when he was writing his stuff. John is not exempt, and thank you, Jim, for acknowledging this. John is not exempt from this collusion. All four gospels collude.
Of details that are in the synoptics. I don't get nervous about that. It doesn't bother me because I see this all the time in eyewitness testimony. Unfortunately, nobody, was able to do what we do in criminal trials, separate people, keep it, what they're talking about, and start at the beginning and work to the end.
Right.
That didn't happen with John, so I get that, but it doesn't mean I'm going to now wrestle and say, well, this is some unusual. I'm not going to go to extraordinary effort.
So for Jim, collusion bothers him, but evidence of collusion doesn't bother him because he knows it happens sometimes. So is there any way that you possibly could have looked at this story, Jim, without coming to the conclusion that is really, what evidence were you looking for? I find it so hard to believe that this is the thing that turns you around to Christianity. I believe you when you say it. I really do. I want to believe, but man, you seem like a smarter guy than this.
Yeah.
To try to say, explain that, because that is so typical of it. You can just stay within the simplicity of eyewitness statements to explain this stuff.
And your intention here isn't per se to harmonize every difference in the gospel. Your intention here is to illustrate that these are reliable eyewitnesses to the events surrounding Jesus' life.
So
again, we're down to this. I love this discrepancy of standards of, well, when a Christian is talking to a non-believer, all they're going for was somewhat reliable. But when they do their internal talks and their indoctrination of kids, it's inerrancy, right? That's a whole separate level of stuff you'd have to prove.
I think that my interest as an atheist was not about inerrancy. I wasn't in circles where that issue was coming up for me. I just bought a Bible for the first time. So I needed to know, is this reliable eyewitness testimony? I do believe in inerrancy, but I think we have to talk about what we mean by that, okay? And for me,
I believe in it, but not in a way that means that there can't be errors, because there are definitely errors, but inerrant.
Me, though, as an investigator.
And back to Frank, actually, that is a fair question. It should be asked in non-flippant terms. What do you mean by inerrancy when you say that? Because it's not a word that we throw around in non-biblical circles very much. So fair. I'll give you that one. That's fair.
Was coming out of atheism. Inerrancy is not the issue. Now, if you said, well, look, we believe that every word is spoken from what I believe we have are eyewitness accounts that were driven by the Holy Spirit, but that retain the kinds of let's put it this way. If God intended for us to get full.
Wait, so you went down a path. He stopped, so I couldn't press him on it, but he went down that path of saying, I believe that it's divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit, but in a way that is indistinguishable from something that isn't from the Holy Spirit, that is something that's indistinguishable from what just people would come up with. So again, where's your falsification criteria here exactly? If you say, well, the Holy Spirit wanted to make it look like it was just a human written book, I guess so, but you wonder why people are falling away? That's not good enough.
Or accounts that we could test in such a way that we could determine that they're reliable, like other reliable eyewitness accounts. He achieved it because we have.
No, if God wanted to make these four gospels in such a way that it was obvious to us they were eyewitness accounts, he wouldn't have had them collude and copy from each other word for word. He absolutely wouldn't have. We would have got four entirely different perspectives that never contradicted, at least not in ways that required crazy bending of plausibility. It would have been stuff that was very easily said, well, no, John didn't tell that story because, he wasn't in that story, whatever. There would be ways to do that. No, what we've got is four works that are clearly based on Mark, that are clearly based on that first work. These don't corroborate each other at all.
A system in place that we can use. And so you might say, well, why would you leave these variations? Because this is the nature of
I don't care about the variations. Why did you have them copy word for word from each other, if indeed they were eyewitnesses?
Do you really think if we had four accounts that were word for word identical, that we would have greater confidence in their reliability? I think we'd have less confidence in their reliability.
Yes, we would. We would have less confidence if they were word for word, which is what I've been saying this whole time. They are word for word the same. They're word for word the same, and they're writing in Greek. And Jesus didn't give his lectures, his speeches, his sermons in Greek. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. So it's not like they're just remembering it perfectly. No, they had to get translated. And then those translations are copied identically. No, this is people copying from each other. You just said if they were word for word, you'd have less confidence. Where is your less confidence? Where is this evidence that this factored in, Jim? I want to believe that this is why you believe, but it is hard.
Mm.
So I don't think God would remove those kinds of differences.
Yeah.
I think that in the end, you might say, well, how do I harmonize these? There's always a way to harmonize them. If you think, well, this is a bit of a stretch, you have not worked my cases. You'd have a harder time believing.
It's true. Again, back in the days when I worked at Lucasfilm and we were attempting to have, I have to bring it up once per stream. I'm sorry. I was literally on the story team and they would find, oh, the film has a contradiction of the novel in this certain way, or so we'd have to come up with what's the story behind that. And sometimes you would harmonize, sometimes you wouldn't. Sometimes it's easy to come up with, oh, well, if we invent, this middle detail that allows these other things to both be true at the same time. Cool. Or sometimes you just gloss over it. For example, kidnapping of Palpatine was very different in the original Clone Wars cartoon than was ultimately ended up being in the movie, because the original scripts of the cartoon were based on the original scripts of the movie, and that got changed and post. Doesn't matter. But yes, literally anything can be harmonized if you are just willing to come up with anything. Ask comic book fans or ask Christians.
Me harmonizing my eyewitnesses. Yet we convicted these guys. And after we convicted some of them, they confessed to it. So although I had crazy, allegedly contradictory accounts, we were able to harmonize them without throwing anything out. And then we convicted these guys based on those accounts. And then they have been.
But you never threw any detail out of any eyewitness. Like you had to have occasionally just said, well, the eyewitness misremembered this. You can't just have accepted every detail.
Eventually confessed that, yes, I did it. So clearly, you can have eyewitness accounts that appear to be contradictory, yet you can know that something is true. So that
I accept. And sometimes the harmonization maybe is just a thing you'll never know. That would have been a less onerous thing, I think, to say, well, sometimes we won't know the reason why these two contradicts, but we do know that, enough of it was reliable and true that it did point to truth because the guy ultimately confessed. So clearly what they saw was true, right? That would have been better. Doesn't maybe make your gospel case as well. We'll see.
To me was it never stalled me. It never became a problem for me. That was the one thing actually that led me to think, oh man, because I know when people lie, they line up their lies. And this to me looked like that principle we talked.
You mean kind of like in the Gospels where they copy each other word for word? I'm not saying they're lying, but it would be indistinguishable from that, wouldn't it?
Talk about of embarrassment. I've known some guys who would include embarrassing things in their lie. I have known guys
in order to be perceived.
Yeah, because they want to be more persuasive with me. So it's not as though it's not.
Yes. Thank you. The criterion of embarrassment. Thank you. That clip I am going to use. Yes, people will throw themselves under the bus and make themselves look bad in a story, convince other people that story is true. Because a lot of times it's more important that the person accept that the story is true than some bit of perception about some other lesser perception about the person. Like, thank you. People include embarrassing details to make a story seem more believable. That is absolutely 100% a clip I'm going to. Thank you, Jim.
Possible for you, but it is one of those pieces. I always say this is death by 1,000 paper cuts. So it's not that this is the one thing that sold it for me. It's just one of hundreds of things that when I look at them together cumulatively, there's not, like people will say, what's the one thing that convinced you? There's not one thing that convinced me. There's never one thing that convinces me unless you could.
The cumulative case thing. Dr. Loke, maybe can hear you from here. Paul, you don't understand the nature of cumulative cases. Yes, I do. Yeah, maybe it's no one piece of evidence, but if you say there's 1,000 cuts, meaning 1,000 pieces of evidence, but I think that 900 of those pieces of evidence, when I examine them carefully, are garbage. 900 times 0 is still 0. So don't give me this cumulative case. That's what you say when, well, none of our individual evidence pieces are very good, but there's a lot, maybe. No, that's not the way it works.
Confesses. It's always going to be on the strength of 100 things that I don't know how you could get to another reasonable inference because of the weight of these 100 things.
Yeah, the cumulative.
And that's where I arrived with this is where I arrived with Christianity.
Nice.
Okay. That was Detective J. Warner Wallace telling us why he thinks that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, even though the one thing that he does to make sure that eyewitness accounts are accurate is he avoids collusion. But did the Gospels avoid collusion? No. He admitted that they're full of collusion. Word for word. If they were word for word, wouldn't that lower your confidence? That's what he said. Why doesn't it lower your confidence, Jim? I don't know. Or maybe I'm out to lunch. Maybe it's not the collusion we should be concerned about. Maybe it is these differences after all. What do you guys think?